Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling one of the biggest questions you can possibly ask. What is reality? And to even begin to figure that out, our investigation has to start in the one and only place it can. And that place is right inside our own heads. This quote really nails it. We are, for all we know, forever locked inside our own consciousness. It's like you're in a room that you can never, ever leave. And everything you think you know about the outside world, every sight, every sound, every scientific measurement, it's all just coming in through the windows of that room.
So this room of consciousness has to be our starting point. It means we have to accept that every single thing we observe, all the data we collect, every theory we come up with about the universe, it's all being filtered through this intensely personal, subjective lens first.
But what is consciousness really? The honest answer is, nobody has a perfect definition. Probably the best way to get a feel for it is with that classic question: what is it like to be a bat? Now, the question isn't about how sonar works. It's about the feeling, the first-person subjective experience of being a bat. It's that what it's likeness of being you. You know, this whole thing is so tricky, so hard to pin down, that for most of the last century, serious scientists just wouldn't go near it. I mean, a major dictionary basically called it a total waste of time. It wasn't really until the mid-90s that people in academia started to seriously try to crack this nut as a real scientific problem.
Okay, so with that in our back pocket, let's look at what became for a long time the official story of reality, the default setting, you could say, that's really dominated science for centuries. And that story is called physicalism. At its core, it's the belief that the universe is just stuff, physical stuff. It's a giant, complicated machine, and if you could just understand all the tiny little cogs and gears, the particles and forces, then you could theoretically understand the whole shebang, from a star going supernova to you feeling happy.
And this is the basic logic behind it, a process called reductionism. It's like a ladder. You start at the top with something complex, like psychology. Well, that's just applied biology, right? And biology, well, that's really just applied chemistry. And what's chemistry? It's just physics in action. So you climb all the way down the ladder, and what's at the bottom holding it all up? Solid physical matter.
But here's the kicker, and this is so important. Physicalism isn't a scientific fact they proved in a lab. It's a metaphysical assumption. It's a philosophical bet on what reality is made of. Science tells us how the clock ticks, but physicalism claims to know what the clock is. And that quote is a great warning. If you don't stop and question that assumption, you're just accepting it on faith.
And this is where our investigation takes a turn, because it turns out the official story is starting to show some pretty deep cracks. We're now looking at clues that suggest reality is a whole lot weirder than a simple machine.
The first big crack is something we've already bumped into, this massive gulf between our inner world and the outer world. On one side, you have your first-person subjective experience, what it feels like to see the color blue, and on the other, you have the third-person objective description of it, neurons firing, wavelengths of light. How do you get from one to the other? Physicalism just doesn't have a good story for how to build that bridge.
And that leads us straight into what's famously called the hard problem. It's simple to state, but, well, incredibly hard to solve. How does a bunch of mindless, unfeeling atoms, the stuff your brain is made of, somehow cook up the rich, private, technicolor movie that is your inner life? How do you get from meat to experience? The official story just kind of shrugs.
Okay, so the second major blow to this simple materialist picture comes from the very foundation of matter itself. When scientists finally looked deep down into the subatomic world, they expected to find tiny, solid little marbles. What they actually found? Well, it blew everyone's minds. They found this bizarre, ghostly realm that just breaks all the rules of common sense. A world where a particle isn't in any one place. It's just a fuzzy cloud of possibilities until the moment you look at it. And then, poof, it snaps into reality. Just think about that. The very act of observing it seems to change it. That doesn't sound like a solid, predictable foundation at all. It sounds more like information or potential or something deeply interconnected.
So, with the official story on the ropes, our investigation has to open up. We need to look at some alternative suspects. If reality isn't just matter, what in the world could it be?
This chart lays out the main contenders pretty well. You've got physicalism, which we've talked about. Consciousness is just a thing the brain does. But then you get panpsychism,
This wild idea says maybe consciousness isn't special to brains at all. Maybe it's a fundamental property of matter, and even an electron has some tiny primitive bit of experience. And then you have the most mind-bending of all, idealism, which just flips the whole script. It says consciousness isn't in the universe is in consciousness.
And just when you think it can't get any stranger, the plot thickens. We start to find real-world cases that seem to fly in the face of the idea that the brain is just a straightforward consciousness-making factory.
Okay, get this. There was this incredible case documented in a major medical journal about a French civil servant. He goes in for a routine brain scan, and they discover he's missing 90% of his brain tissue. His skull was basically just filled with fluid.
So, what was his life like with only 10% of a brain? He was married, he had 2 kids, he held down a steady job. By all accounts, he was a totally normal guy. Now, how is that possible if the physical brain is supposed to be the one and only thing creating our entire conscious reality?
And the list of these head-scratchers just keeps going. You have people who suffer brain damage and suddenly become musical or mathematical geniuses. People who report incredibly detailed near-death experiences while their brain shows absolutely no activity. And maybe the weirdest of all, brain scans showing that during these unbelievably rich psychedelic trips, brain activity actually goes down. All this evidence points to a really startling possibility. What if the brain doesn't create consciousness at all? What if it's more like a radio receiver or maybe even a filter that tunes into it?
So after all that, where does it leave us in our investigation? Well, the case of what is reality is very, very far from closed.
Here's what we can say. The official story, physicalism, has some massive holes in it. The hard problem of consciousness and the absolute weirdness of the quantum world, they're like 2 star witnesses for the prosecution. And they're both testifying that a reality made of just mindless stuff is, at the very least, an incomplete story.
Which brings us to this final, really provocative question. Are we on the verge of being able to explore these questions ourselves, to venture beyond the accepted story? What if we're on the cusp of a whole new kind of science, one that can finally bring together the outer world of objects and the inner world of experience? What might we find out about the universe and about ourselves if we're just brave enough to keep digging?